Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Valerie Wasmer. I'm the new Associate Director, Education Director here. And when I was told I had to do a Thursday night series and line up speakers that had a little bit to know and say, I knew exactly who I needed to get here for my first official Thursday night lecture series. This is Steve Glischinski. He is a trained expert, I think. I'm amazed at what he knows. And so he graciously agreed to come down from Shoreview this evening and share his vast knowledge about trains and some of the images he's taken over the years. I might be a little biased because he's family, but I think he's pretty good. So please welcome Steve Glischinski.
Thank you. I'm married to her first cousin. We have this thing going, she's the giant Vikings fan and I'm more of a Packers fan. I was just in Norway. I just got back from Norway. And we were going to a museum and they had a Viking ship, a genuine real Viking ship. I said, well, it's closed for 2 years. They're refurbishing it. So of course I said to the guy, oh, another Vikings rebuild. Anyway. Well, thanks for coming tonight. I appreciate it. My name's Steve Glischinski. I got interested in railroads about the age of 10, and I got interested in railroads because my dad was cheap. My dad worked his entire life with Northwest Airlines, and those who remember Northwest may remember it as somewhat of a frugal company. And my dad, being the frugal guy working for the frugal company, figured out early on, we lived in Highland Park in St. Paul neighborhood, that the city of St. Paul would pick up your trash once a week for something like $1. Well, my dad figured out if he took it down to the Pig's Eye landfill, it was only 50 cents. Oh. So every Saturday, my brother and I and the garbage would get into a station wagon and we would drive it down to the Pig's Eye landfill. And the Pig's Eye landfill just so happened to be next to the Milwaukee Road Railroad Yard. So my dad, being a guy, and us guys, we're all into things that move and are big, and of course trains fit the bill. He would say, well, you boys want to watch trains? And we would go, oh yeah, that'd be great. So we kind of developed a system. We were both, young and blonde haired, blue eyed. And right outside the railroad yard there along Hoffman Avenue there, the trains would come before they went in the yard, they would stop. And so the diesels would be stopped there. And my brother and I would get out of the car, and inevitably the engineer or fireman would open up the window. And he goes, hey, you guys ever been on one of these? And we went, no. And so they would invite us up, and we would get up in the cab and they'd give us the tour. And then they'd say, oh, we gotta go, we're pulling away, we have to get back in the yard. And so they would pull in, and then the next train would pull up, and the guy would lean out and go, you guys ever been on? No, never been on anything like this. So then one year my dad decided to go for broke. He took us down to the St. Paul Union Depot. And of course, we had tons of passenger trains there. And we had the Great Northern Empire Builder, and we had the Northern Pacific North Coast Limited, and they would sit on parallel tracks. They left pretty close to the same time. And my dad said, well, we should try and go down and get on one of those. So down we went. I think we went to the Empire Builder first. And it was really cold out. We were all bundled up. And again, the cute kids. And we looked up at the engine, and the engineer said, you guys ever been up on one of these? And no. We got up in the cab of the Empire Builder. And then we went back up into the depot, up and around and back down on the other platform by the North Coast Limited of the Northern Pacific, and did the same maneuver. And by God, we got in both of them on the same night. So that just kind of stuck with me. And my dad, even though he was an airline guy and remained with Northwest for over 40 years, he always liked trains too. So, and we used to fly to take the train. We would fly out to Montana and ride the North Coast Limited and go out and see the old Milwaukee Road Electric, the operation I had up there. So it's just something that stuck with me and has ever since. So subsequently, I've written several books. And I also am a correspondent with Trains Magazine, which is right here. And in fact, in the latest issue, this is a photo by me there on the cover, and an article about a rehabilitation of steam locomotives going on down in Illinois, so. So, let's talk about, if I can get this to work. It says, no signal, Valerie. No, here's a nice scenic area. He really looks good.
Keeps timing out on
I didn't know about just red mountains.
Gotta get down here more often.
I apparently gotta start skiing, so.
We have snow though.
So this is and we're obviously not gonna go into super great detail tonight with the time we have, but this is a map of the railroad system of Minnesota as it currently exists. This is the different railroads here. We won't go through all of them, but it gives you a good overview. There's not a lot of branch lines anymore with railroads in Minnesota. Mainly they're main lines, but there's a few branches here and there that you can see. So Minnesota railroads go back to June of 1862. That was when the first train ran between Minneapolis and St. Paul, what was then St. Anthony, on a predecessor railroad of the Great Northern. And the engine that pulled that train is right here. This is the William Crooks. That was the very first locomotive in Minnesota. You can see it today up at the Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth, where it's on display. Sitting next to it here is another famous locomotive. This was the first locomotive of the Northern Pacific Railway, which was the second transcontinental railroad after the Union Pacific went across the continent. You all might remember that. In 1870, they started building the Northern Pacific from Carleton, Minnesota. This was the first engine that was used and was built in 1870, used in that construction project. So we're very lucky that both these engines survived, and you can actually see them here in Minnesota. So railroads, when they were constructed, they were the main source of transportation in Minnesota for many decades. You know, before the railroads came, you had steamboats, you had wagon trails, and you had your horse. That was pretty much it. Water was a big one. Railroads opened things up, and they became really a part of American life as they grew. So, for example, here we are in 1912 up in Ely, and you have this group that traveled up to Ely for the jobbers, whatever a jobber was. Somebody might know what a jobber was, but this is a Duluth Mississippi Iron Range. But just kind of an example of how people use railroads all the time. And since we're close to the state fair, and I mentioned how it was kind of part of American life, one of the big deals at the state fair was the thrill show. And they honestly, they really did run steam locomotives together as part of the thrill show. And in this particular one was in 1933. And they had, one of the engines was labeled Great Depression and the other one was labeled National Recovery. And they crashed them together. And, you know, parts would fly and go everywhere. And I guess they weren't really concerned about liability lawsuits then. You got hit by a piece of shrapnel, so too bad. But it was just part of that whole railroads being a part of our everyday life. So when the railroads came and started to become a part of our lives, they primarily presented passenger service, and they were the main mode of transportation. In fact, railroads held the market share as the majority mode of transportation in the United States till about 1957. It was that late before airlines overtook them. But and then that does not include automobiles. But when they came, they had to build depots, and particularly in the Twin Cities, substantial depots. And this is the Milwaukee Road Depot that was built in 1898 in Minneapolis. This depot still exists today. It still has this big train shed behind it where the trains used to park. But if you come up and see this depot today, you've noticed that it does not have this tower up here anymore. That actually got blown off in a windstorm in, I think, about 1941. But the depot is preserved, it's a hotel. But this depot served the Rock Island, Milwaukee Road, and the Siouxland. And saw its last train in 1971 when Amtrak came. This is the second St. Paul Union Depot, built in downtown St. Paul. This was built in the 1880s. The first depot was built and burned down a few years later. So they rebuilt it, and the second depot, and guess what happened? It burned down. So at that point, they threw in the towel and said, okay, enough with the burning down, we need to build a more substantial depot, which they did starting in 1917. And that's the St. Paul Union Depot as it exists today. This is a picture from the 20s, but this depot is still in service today. It has an interesting story. It served all the railroads of the Twin Cities until 1971, passenger trains. Until 1971, when Amtrak took over passenger service in Minnesota. And I actually had the sad duty, so to speak. I stood on the platforms of that depot. I was 14 years old and I watched the last train leave in 1971. But there'll be a sequel to the story coming up. So this is the interior of the depot when it opened. Notice the chandeliers up there. We're gonna come back to that shortly, but pay attention to that. But that is the concourse area where you can wait for trains. And it's a huge building. And we had 9 railroads serve that building at one time, and over 200 trains at one time, a day. So here's some folks waiting for the train in the Union Depot back in the 40s or 50s, reading the Pioneer Press. And of course, it was a busy place, just like the airport is today. It was basically what the airport is today. Very, very busy. So the railroads, as they went along, they carried the most number of passengers right around World War I. And then as automobiles came along, passenger service kind of went into decline. And the railroads decided they would try and fight back to get back market share. And in the early 1930s, right when the Depression started, they developed streamlined trains. And so the Milwaukee Road was one of the early companies to bring streamlined trains in 1935. And there you may have heard of the Hiawatha's. Hiawatha ran between Chicago and Minneapolis, St. Paul. And train went over 100 miles an hour in spots in Wisconsin, near Red Wing also. And it was such a big success that the first Hiawatha was built in 1935. They re-equipped the train in 1938. And because railroads were really good at handling PR back then, they brought the new train up to different areas for display. So this is the 1938 version of the Hiawatha with a streamlined steam engine at the Minnehaha Depot in Minneapolis. And in fact, that depot is still there. This train, of course, and the engineers are long gone, but the depot is still there and it's open in summer weekends. And here's the Hiawatha from 1938 leaving Red Wing. They had these very distinctive observation cars. This was called a beaver tail car. And you could sit back here on couches and this little area right here shadowed the windows. So you'd have a nice view out the back. And this train, again, like the previous Hiawatha, would go over 100 miles an hour through parts of Wisconsin.
What year was that?
This was about 1938 or early 40s.
Where was my hometown?
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. But the first streamlined passenger train that served the Twin Cities was not the Hiawatha. It was the Twin Zephyrs, which started in April 1935. Barely beating out the Hiawatha because the Hiawatha started in May 1930. Now, this is not the 1935 train. This was the 1947 trains. This was the Twin Zephyrs, or twice a day between Chicago and Minneapolis, St. Paul. And these were the first trains in the country to have dome cars on the 1947 version. And there's an example. Notice all the domes on the train. You could take these twice a day. Down to Chicago from the Twin Cities. They were great trains. And again, the idea of clever PR, when they started the Twin Zephyrs in the 1930s, the Burlington said, well, it's Twin Zephyrs because we're twice a day to the Twin Cities. How are we gonna advertise this? So on the first trains, the entire trains were filled with sets of twins. And they rode the train up to the Twin Cities. So very clever. And here's the Twin Zephyr crossing the famous Stone Arch Bridge. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Stone Arch Bridge in Minneapolis. This is it in 1959. It used to be, of course, a railroad bridge. This was the only bridge on the Great Northern Railway, which was started by James J. Hill, that James J. Hill allowed to be named for him. This was actually, if you look on the far end of the bridge, there's a big plaque. and it says James J. Hill on it. So, and of course, today it's a walking trail, but of course, because it's Minnesota, it's currently closed for rehabilitation for the next 3 years. Even though we don't drive on it, which is interesting. So this is the Empire Builder, the Great Northern, again, very cleverly, where they started a new train in 1929. Between Chicago and Twin Cities and Seattle. And they called it the Empire Builder after James J. Hill, who was known as the Empire Builder. And right after World War II, it was re-equipped with new cars. And so the Great Northern took that train around different areas, even areas that weren't served by the train. So this is an example of that. This is up at the Union Depot in Duluth. And the Empire Builder never went to Duluth, but they took the new cars up there. This is 1947 and showed them off so that people would want to ride the train. So of course, there were other railroads involved around Minnesota, of course. Everyone's probably heard of the Rock Island, the famous Rock Island line, mighty fine. This is the Twin Star Rocket crossing the Mississippi River in Minneapolis. This train ran between the Twin Cities and Houston. And again, clever names. It was Twin Cities and, twins. And it was the North Star State, and it ran to Texas, the Lone Star State, and hence you have the Twin Star Rocket. So, all the Rock Island trains were known, their streamliners were called rockets. They came up with that and called them the rockets. The Chicago Northwestern also developed streamlined trains, and their trains were called the 400s. The 400s became famous again in that whole area in 1935. When Chicago and Northwestern started the 400, the Milwaukee Road started the Hiawatha, the Burlington started the Twin Zephyrs. They all started in 1935. When the Chicago Northwestern's version started, it wasn't streamlined. It didn't get streamlined until 1939. But this is that train, the streamlined version of the 400. Got its name because it went 400 miles in 400 minutes from here to Chicago, Twin Cities to Chicago. So this is it crossing the Stone Arch Bridge, very late in its career. And you had a 400 here in Rochester. So this is the Dakota 400. The Dakota 400 started in 1950 and ran from Chicago through Rochester and out to Huron, South Dakota. And in 1955, it was extended further west and went all the way to Rapid City, South Dakota. And this was the only one of the Chicago Northwestern 400 trains that had sleeping cars because it was such a long run that you couldn't do it without a sleeper. It only ran to Rapid City for 5 years, and then it was cut back in 1960 to Mankato, and then it just became a Chicago Mankato train via Rochester, of course. And they changed the name of the train to the Rochester 400. And then that only lasted until 1963 when it was discontinued along with the 400. So if you wanted to travel on these trains, the two trains met in Wygo, Wisconsin. This is at Wygo, that's the Twin Cities 400 and the Rochester 400. This was 1962. They would connect there. So you could ride the 400 and connect with the Rochester 400 and vice versa. So I wanted to throw in a few pictures that I took here in Rochester. You had two railroads that served Rochester at one time in the modern era. You had the Chicago Great Western and you had the Chicago Northwestern. And the Chicago Northwestern actually purchased the Chicago Great Western in 1968 and merged it into its system. So after that, you only had one railroad, but that was a little bit before my time, but I did get down here to see the Chicago Northwestern quite a bit. So here's a train leaving Rochester back in May of 1980. And here's another one heading west out of Rochester. It's a steep hill west of town here, Byron Hill, they call it, that the trains have to go up. And this is the Chicago Northwestern train heading west back in 76. Now, eventually the Chicago Northwestern sold their line through here to the Dakota, Minnesota and Eastern, the Mayo Clinic's favorite railroad. You may recall. But the Mayo Clinic actually, you may recall that the DM&E wanted to build a line out into the Powder River Basin of Wyoming to bring coal. And there was a huge fight, and the Mayo, in effect, killed that proposal and did the railroad a huge favor. Because guess what? nobody wants to build a railroad to the Powder River Basin anymore because coal is going like that. And you may recall Kevin Schieffer was the president of the Dakota, Minnesota and Eastern and was fairly reviled around here. Because he wanted to do that. Well, when Rochester killed the program for the DM&E, they ended up selling the railroad to Canadian Pacific. And Kevin Schieffer became a multi-millionaire. So I'm sure he's actually thanking all of you for the Mayo Clinic for opposing that because he never has to work another day in his life. So it all worked out well for everybody involved in the end. But the Dakota, Minnesota and Eastern itself got merged into Canadian Pacific in 2008, as I said, but was quite a successful railroad in its day. Now, the other railroad in Rochester was the Chicago Great Western, and that railroad had kind of a tougher time. They were never really super profitable. They got to most places after other railroads had already been there. But this is a Chicago Great Western engine pulling a little local freight at Cannon Falls. Crossing the river there. And the Great Western, though, was famous in these parts because they ran two very famous passenger trains here. This was the Red Bird and the other train was the Bluebird that ran between Rochester and the Twin Cities. Now, this train was started about 1925 or so. And it actually ran nonstop from St. Paul to Rochester. And the way it did it, though, was it came down the Great Western Main Line, which ran through Randolph and Kenyon. And when they got to Dodge Center, they took a turn there and they had rights on the Chicago Northwestern track to come into Rochester. And they were able to run this train and it only took 2.5 hours to get from St. Paul to Rochester on this track. And it was painted red and hence the name the Redbird. So the Great Western had some success with the Redbird, so they said, well, let's add in the second train on their other route. Their other route was they would come down to Randolph, cut over to Red Wing, come down through Pine Island and down into Rochester. And so they invented the Bluebird for that route. And this was kind of a precedent-setting train in that notice no steam locomotive. This was a gas electric motor car train. So it was all internal combustion, which no railroads were really doing at the time. This was 1929. So they introduced this train in 1929. They chose poorly because there's another event in 1929 that happened called the stock market crash. So the Bluebird only lasted 2 or 3 years, but it was a trendsetter on the Great Western for internal combustion power. Now, some of you might remember the old roundhouse here in Rochester. Thought I'd throw a shot in there of that. This is the old Chicago Great Western Roundhouse. I looked around on Google Earth, and I believe there's a Pawn America on the spot here. But I took this shot back in 1976 of that local train, which we're going to see in a moment. And there, the old Great Western Roundhouse, even though the railroad had been merged in with the Chicago Northwestern in 1968, you still had Chicago Great Western caboose on the back. So this is that local train. You had the line that came down from Red Wing and through Rochester and went straight south and down to McIntyre, Iowa. And so this is that line. This is in 1976 when the Northwestern had it. This is the old depot at Spring Valley. So, and this line at the time I took these pictures, it ran 1 day a week and it was ran on Saturdays. So I came down to chase it and get some pictures. And then you remember those motor cars I showed you that were on the Bluebird? Well, these are an example of those motor cars. I'm not sure this is exactly what was used on the Bluebird, but the Great Western was a frugal outfit. And so this is at Ostrander, Minnesota, and they reused one of their old motor cars as a depot. So I remember the first time I went there in 76, and the train came once a week, but they still had a guy sitting in the depot. And I remember walking in, the guy having his can of soup on a hot plate for lunch. And I walked in and he said, no, they only come once a week. So when you talk about railroads and trains, everybody loves steam locomotives. And we were blessed here in Minnesota. We had some pretty cool steam locomotives back in the day that ran in Minnesota. And this is an example of that. This is the Sioux line at Shoreham Shops, their big shop facility in Minneapolis. And this locomotive was called a 484. It has four lead wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. These were very powerful locomotives built by the Lima Locomotive Works. And the Sioux Line had 4 of these used in fast freight service between Minneapolis and Chicago. And of course, the Great Northern was based in Minnesota, founded by James J. Hill. And his railroad always was profitable. And this is again, kind of what you think of when you think of a steam engine, pulling this big, long consist of freight cars, rattling along with the big, powerful steam locomotive on the front. And this is what you think of when you think of the engineer. And this is the engineer in the steam locomotive. Notice he has the coveralls, he has a bandana to keep the cinders off, he's got his cap to keep the cinders off his head. He's got his train orders here, they call them, which are orders given to him from the various depots along the line or from the chief dispatcher, and tells him where he might have a meet or speed restrictions. And any of you out there that are railroaders are familiar with that. These are all communicated by radio today, but back in the day, the depot agent would give them to him. This is another example of a guy running a steam locomotive. This is a engineer Ed App running a Duluth Mesabian Iron Range steam locomotive in 1959. These were some of the biggest steam locomotives to ever run in Minnesota. The Mesabi to haul iron ore to the docks. They're in 2 harbors in Duluth. And there he is looking out at night. This is up in Proctor with the steam engine. These particular steam engines were called Yellowstones because the first railroad that bought them was the Northern Pacific and used them on their Yellowstone division. And there's actually 3 of these engines that were saved by the Duluth Mesabian Iron Range. And the 227, the one number before this one, is up in the Lake Superior Railroad Museum in Duluth, and you can go and push a button and it makes the wheels turn, the lights come on, and the sound comes on too. So it's very well preserved and beautiful engine. And of course, I mentioned how railroads were a part of everyday life. This is an example of the local train coming into Paynesville, Minnesota on the Sioux Line. And I really like this picture. It has a lot to it. You have the local depot, which, you know, was kind of the center of town. If you look close, you can see the depot agent is handing up orders. Remember I talked about orders a minute ago? They had a fork that they put the orders in, and as the engine went by, the fireman or engineer could lean out and grab them. So they're doing that. And then this is a Griswold signal. And the Griswold signals were built in Minneapolis, and they were the ones, you may recall, that when the train came, the stop sign turned and flipped to stop as the lights flashed, which I thought growing up were everywhere, but they were very much a Midwest signal. And so I would run into railroad fans later and they go, "Oh man, you got pictures of Griswolds?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, they're all over." "Oh no, not where we live." So it was really a Midwest institution, the Griswold Signal Company. And there still are a handful of Griswolds around if you look hard, but not very many. And I mentioned the Milwaukee Road Depot, built in 1898. And this is a look at Minneapolis. This is looking under the train shed here of a couple trains, a Rock Island train, one of the rockets getting ready to go. And on the left is a Sioux Line steam powered train. This train shed they're sitting underneath was a block long. And as I mentioned, it still exists today. When they rebuilt the depot, they made part of it an ice skating rink, but they've since gotten rid of that. And now it's just used for event space. And in fact, I've given this presentation under the shed there at the event space. So steam locomotives were the dominant form from the time the railroad started till about the 1940s and 50s. And you can kind of tell why. What happened that steam was eliminated? Well, when you start counting, here's a guy here, here's a guy here, here's a guy here, and here's a guy here. Just at a service stop, this is in Dilworth, for the North Coast Limited to grease the engine and make sure everything's okay. And of course, they had to have coal or oil and water. So they were very labor intensive. Here's another example. This is a switch crew up in Duluth. Some of them are on the switch crew, some of them are working on the engines, but it was very labor intensive to run a steam locomotive. They had to go in the shops and be rebuilt periodically. But then you had diesels, and this is an example of why the railroads switched to diesel power. This is 1940. This is the first run of the morning Hiawatha to Chicago. with, using diesel power. And they're breaking a bottle there, the bottle they're breaking is a bottle of water from Minnehaha Creek, not champagne. And I'm presuming, in Chicago, they broke a bottle from Lake Michigan. But this particular engine, called number 15, they used to call it Fabulous 15 on the Milwaukee Road, because what it did was, it would start out of Minneapolis on the morning Hiawatha, it would run down to Chicago, they would turn it around, and they would put it on the overnight fast mail train back up to Minneapolis, where they would turn it around and put it back on the morning Hiawatha. And they did that back and forth for 7 years without a major failure.
Oh.
So you basically put the oil in and put the fuel in and ran them, and that is why steam ended up dying. So here we are in the Milwaukee Road Depot again with another newer example of the diesel power that pulled these trains. This is the afternoon Hiawatha, and they're comparing their watches. The fireman and the engineer had to make sure their watches were in sync, so they were exactly on time when they ran. And they also, the conductor would have to synchronize his watch as well. So to maintain, even diesel locomotives need to be maintained as long, and so with the steam. So there are several railroads with big shops in Minnesota. The Sioux Line's big shops were in Shoreham and Minneapolis along Central Avenue there. You had shops for the Great Northern was Dale Street in St. Paul. The Northern Pacific had a shop in Minneapolis. The Duluth-Mesabi Iron Range had a shop up in Proctor. And Two Harbors. So that was all to maintain the steam locomotives and then eventually the diesels. And of course, labor intensive, you have to have a dispatcher. Dispatcher is the person that dispatches the trains, issues the orders. And there he is on the Duluth-Mesabi Iron Range at Iron Junction. Getting ready to talk on his radio, making some notes. And of course, on the trains was also, you have to have a lot of people. One of the reasons that passenger trains came to lose a lot of money is you had to have a lot of people on board to give the proper service. So this is the steward in the dining car in the North Coast Limited in 1959. He's doing his receipts. He kept track of everything in the diner, the money that came in, the employees he was in charge of, the supplies had to be kept up. So he did all those things. And of course, you have the depot agent. So the depot agent in the beginning would sell tickets to the passenger trains. Every town had a depot. The agent was the face of the railroad for that town. You would also order you might order something out of the Sears catalog and it would be delivered to the depot. You could pick it up. But in later years, it strictly became a place where the depot operator communicated with the dispatcher and other railroad workers after the end of the passenger trains and losing the small freight that they had. Winter in Minnesota is always a fun time for railroads. As you know, it can be rugged or this winter not. You can see this is just the snow covered surface. The trains run 24/7. This is a private mining railroad up in northern Minnesota, the North Shore Mining Railroad. It hauls raw taconite ore from Babbitt over to Silver Bay, where they make it into taconite pellets and then ship it east on ships to steel mills. This railroad is completely private, 47 miles, basically through the wilderness. Used to be reserve mining. You might remember reserve mining from the famous case of dropping the tailings in Lake Superior. They don't do that anymore. They take the taconite tailings and haul them up by train and dump them on land now, so. And of course, again, even all winter long, you have to keep going and it's cold, and in the steam days, of course, you had to put water in your steam locomotives. So this is the water tank at Cloquet, Minnesota on the Duluth and Northeastern Railroad. And this particular locomotive, this was taken about 1959. The Duluth and Northeastern was the last railroad in Minnesota to run steam engines. They ran steam until 1964. This particular engine was sold and is operating today out in California. And there's a couple other Duluth and Northeastern engines. We'll see another one soon that are still running today. And this is kind of a fun photo. This is steaming ore. Before the advent of taconite pellets, which were those little pellets that were used from the raw taconite, you used to have regular, they called it natural iron ore, which is more like the consistency of dirt. So when it started to get cold in the fall, you'd want to get the ore, the natural ore down to the docks, but sometimes it would freeze. So Duluth Mississauga and Iron Range had these big facilities in their yards in Proctor and Two Harbors, where the steam engine would be used, and there was pipes that ran under the tracks. And they could take these big long rods and insert them into the ore cars, and they would steam the ore, heat it up, and then they'd zip it down to the dock and dump it in the boat before it refroze. So you'd have these massive plumes of steam at Proctor and Two Harbors, but then around December, they typically shut the railroad down then and didn't start up again until spring, because it got just too cold. And of course, railroads were known as being all-weather transportation. They usually didn't have meltdowns like Delta, but this is an example of how they got through. You know, the engines are all totally frozen over. This was taken at the Milwaukee Road Depot in Minneapolis, but the train got through. You could rely on the passenger trains to get through even in bad weather. It was not a fun job to keep the trains on time and keep them running. This is some fellas sweeping out a switch at the Minneapolis Great Northern Depot, which Amtrak used when they first started in 1971 until 1978. And this is the crew getting the track clear there for the train to depart. So when sometimes you had to get out the snow plows when things got bad. This was taken in 1975 by me. This was big storms in March of 1975. And they advised no travel whatsoever in the state. So of course we went out and we went out on Highway 55 and followed the Sioux Line train. Sioux Line ran a plow from Minneapolis to Glenwood, from Enderlin, North Dakota to Glenwood, and from Thief River Falls to Glenwood, all converging on Glenwood. And this is the train from Enderlin, North Dakota, coming at us. I'm standing on an overpass here and it's going through this big cut and snow's just flying. It was kind of a scary job because sometimes these plows would derail. You never knew what you were running into. So the guys up in the little upper area there, they actually wore seat belts up in there in case it went flying. So this is that same era taken by another fellow. This is the train, the plow train stopped at Paynesville, Minnesota overnight, stopped for the night, and they're going to continue to plow the next morning. Now, when things really get bad, and it's quite rare in Minnesota to find it, but they'll get out the rotary snow plows, which are kind of like your snow blower that you use in your driveway. It's got a big wheel and it throws the snow, and it's got to be pretty bad for the railroads to get out the rotary snow plow. But a few years ago, they did run one in Minnesota, so we went out there to catch it. Now, notice where I'm standing. Now, that's all well and good, but the real problem is, I also parked here. And that was not so the windshield kind of got damaged. And so we looked at it and went, well, it isn't that bad. So we continued to follow the plow, even so. And eventually we gave up and I drove back to Wilmer and got a new windshield. But for the rest of the time I had that car, when you put on the air AC, a little bit of glass would come. Also, though, another thing, and a quite dangerous thing, this particularly rotary, the next day, I had their windshield repaired, went back to get it again, and there was a catastrophic accident, and all the blades of the snow flew off. Luckily, they went going by a field, but if somebody had been standing there like me, you would have been ventilated. So anyway, don't park on the side of this. So I like to bring up the fact that Minnesota actually had railroad tunnels. Not a lot of them. I believe it was 5. There's only one that's active today, but this is one near Duluth. This is under Ely's Peak. This was on the Duluth-Winnipeg Pacific Railway. This tunnel was abandoned in 1984, but you can still, there is a trail and you can walk through it. Up on the private Erie Mining Company Railroad, which ran between White Lakes and Taconite Harbor, they drilled a tunnel in 1955 or 56. Through a big hillside there and used that. The last time a train went through this tunnel was 2008, but it still exists, it's still just sitting there. And then this is the active tunnel, this is at Westminster Street in St. Paul. Just north of downtown, a lot of people don't know about it, but there's a tunnel there. This photo was taken by an engineer friend of mine going through the tunnel. You can see that all the brick there, the tunnel was actually built in the 1880s. And this tunnel is used every day, mainline trains come through it. It's on the BNSF railway, so we still have one active tunnel in Minnesota. What do railroads in Minnesota carry? Well, a lot of grain. Grain is a big deal. Here you can see the grain being loaded here. They got, the guy here is loading that, and then you can see the train on the approach up there, coming to pick up the car. So that's one of the big commodities in Minnesota. Another big one is the taconite pellets up in the northern part of the state. The BNSF and now Canadian National, which bought the Duluth-Mesabi Iron Range in 2004. They haul a lot of these pellets. This is they're loading pellets at the Mintac mine in Mountain Iron and getting ready to haul it to Two Harbors or Duluth. Now, in the 1970s, things weren't going too well for the railroads. They had lost their passenger service to airplanes and cars. They've been very heavily regulated by the US government. They couldn't change, for example, if you wanted to change your rate, you had to go and file a rate change with the Interstate Commerce Commission. It might take months for you to just to raise your rate. You couldn't make contracts with companies. It was very restrictive. That changed in 1980 when they passed the Staggers Rail Act, which basically deregulated the railroads. And since that time, since 1980, the railroads have really, really bounced back. But it looked pretty problematic in the 1970s. And they still had railroad branch lines in many places that were hard to abandon. Again, with the Staggers Act, it was easier to abandon them. So this is an example. This was a local train on this rickety branch line that ran from Farmington to Shakopee in 1977. And that's what it looks like today. You can see it's a trail, and this is the exact same spot in Lakeville. So the branch line is gone, replaced by a trail. The porterhouse here, really good place if you ever want to eat there. It's really great. A little pricey, but it's good. And even the main lines were getting kind of rickety. This is the Milwaukee Road. Milwaukee Road was bankrupt in 1977. And they couldn't maintain their right of way very well. They didn't have a lot of money, and you could see that the track is not the greatest. This particular Amtrak train at that time was restricted to 40 miles an hour. So you get on Amtrak to ride to Chicago, most of the way to be 40. So it took a long time, but happily that turned around after deregulation. And so today we have several large and profitable railroads. This is the BNSF Railway. This was is the largest railroad in the state. It's owned by Warren Buffett, who back in 2010 looked at BNSF and said, you know, these guys are doing a great job. I think Berkshire Hathaway should buy it, which was a huge endorsement for railroads in the 70s. No investment house would go near a railroad. So that shows you how much it's changed. And also what's changed, remember the engineer sitting in his coveralls and his kerchief. This is what you have today. If you're running a train, you have your throttle here, you have your mug of coffee, most important. And I believe right here you have your paycheck, also really important. But the horn is here and different buttons for the sanders and stuff. So, and of course, the air conditioning up at the top. So it's a little bit different animal than back in the days as steam locomotives. And the railroads have kind of sort of taken a more active view toward the public. This is an example of that, the Canadian Pacific Holiday Train. Each year, some of you came to Rochester, I remember a few years ago. They work for food shelves. They give money to food shelves and they do hand out gifts and things, and they have a stage show. So it's really a great thing. Another railroad that comes here that in Minnesota, this is the largest bridge in the state of Minnesota, railroad bridge. This is the Canadian National line that goes across over the St. Croix River north of Stillwater. They only run a couple trains a day on this line, but this was a former Sioux Line bridge. And is very big, it was built in, I believe, 1910, and is quite the structure. And the other major railroad in Minnesota is Union Pacific. In 1995, they bought the Chicago and Northwestern, excuse me, and became Union Pacific. Most of you know is the original first transcontinental railroad, and it's one of the last railroads in the country operating under its original name. Excuse me. So we've even had an upsurge in passenger train. For example, we started the North Star commuter train between Minneapolis and Big Lake. Now, the problem is it was supposed to be built to St. Cloud and was only built to Big Lake. And who wants to go to Big Lake? But someday maybe it'll make it to St. Cloud. So it has not been as successful as it could have been, but hopefully it will continue. Oh, she got here. Thank you. So this is actually the conductor on the very first North Star train in 2009. This is up at Big Lake. Oops. Oh. This was last week, yeah. North Star, the good thing about the commuter train, of course, is if you're driving your car, no fun, but if you're on the train, you can get right through the snow and get to Anoka, Coon Rapids, on time. And it's great for riding to Twins games and Vikings games because they do have service for them. Really great way to get there because you can park at one of the outlying stations for nothing and ride it right in. This is the St. Paul Union Depot. Again, 1970s, a period of decline. This was after the last passenger trains ran on the eve of Amtrak. I mentioned I was there and watched the last one leave. They tore the tracks out. Eventually, they tore out all these butterfly sheds. This was, of course, after the last train left, and the land was purchased by the US Postal Service, who also purchased that concourse. Remember the photo of the concourse with the chandeliers? We're gonna come back down. And the Postal Service used this concourse, was basically sent empty. They used it for storage. Or as I always used to say, that's where they stored my mail. So, starting in 2012, Ramsey County purchased the building and spent $250 million to refurbish it, and it is a great, great building. So this is actually a composite of two photos I took. This is the side of the concourse before they started working. And you notice here the skylights are covered. That was done during World War II to blackout. You see the paint is falling off, and they have these fluorescent lights. And then as we go this way, this is as it's done all refurbished. They did research and discovered the color was yellow originally. And remember those chandeliers from 1926? There they are. They replicated them. And it's just a beautiful building. They use it for events and they even use it for trains. So. And I mentioned I sat and I was standing on the platform in 1971 and watched the last train leave. In 2014, I stood on the platform and watched the first train come in. And so this is a photo I took that night. And it's something I never imagined in my wildest dreams would ever happen, that the Union Depot will get trains back, but they did. Even steam locomotives have kind of sort of made a comeback in terms of special operations. One of the biggest ones was the American Freedom Train, 1975. Pulled the bicentennial train all across the United States. This was an engine that was sitting in a park in Portland, Oregon the year before. And in 1970, late 74, they pulled it out of the park and refurbished it. And this is it pulling the Freedom Train across the Stone Arch Bridge in Minneapolis. Union Pacific, I mentioned UP, the original railroad, they have two steam locomotives they keep in operation. One of their steam locomotives, not pictured here, but number 844, is the only steam locomotive owned by a big railroad that was never retired. It was built in 1944, and the railroad has kept it ever since and runs it periodically. This particular locomotive, the number 3985, is called a Challenger type, quite a large locomotive, built in 1943, and it made a tour through the Midwest in 2008, came up to Albert Lee and actually up to the Twin Cities. So here it is going through Albert Lee. This engine has since been retired by Union Pacific and acquired by another group and is in Silvis, Illinois right now. And that's a picture of Steve Sandberg with the group that's restoring it, and he's standing in the boiler of the 3985. So when they retired the 3985, Union Pacific actually upgraded. And the Union Pacific used to operate 25 examples of the world's largest steam locomotive, the big boy, they called them. And they were for the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike. They had saved 8 of them and given them to different organizations around the United States. They reacquired one from a place in California, spent several $1 million to refurbish it, and ran it around the system. And in fact, it ran this summer on the western part of the system. But this is the big boy climbing up the grade in St. Paul, meeting 2 BNSF freights. Never thought, another site I never thought I'd see. I was in California and saw that engine sitting on display when I was a kid. And it's like, Canadian Pacific also runs a steam locomotive that they reacquired from a museum, refurbished and ran around the system. And this was just taken last month. This engine went on a tour from Calgary all the way to Mexico City because Canadian Pacific merged with Kansas City Southern, and the president of the Canadian Pacific said, if we merge, we'll run that steam engine all the way to Mexico City. And they did. So this is on its return. This is out at Kimball, Minnesota, making its way up to Winnipeg and eventually back to Calgary. And here in Minnesota, we have our own steam engine, the largest coal burning steam engine running these days. That's Milwaukee Road 261. Some of you here have been on it, behind it, ridden it. This is it out at Glencoe, Minnesota, making a special run. That car in the back is a rear end car from the 1948 Hiawatha streamliner that ran from Chicago to the Twin Cities. It's called a Skytown. It's an excellent car to ride in. It's got all glass in the back, as you can see. And this is number 261 climbing up the hill. This was last year. I helped organize an event called Union Depot Train Days at St. Paul Union Depot. And last year we had the 261 over for a visit. It's based in Minneapolis. And it runs about once or twice a year. They do a Polar Express type event each December at Union Depot. And up in Duluth, Minnesota, the Lake Superior Railroad Museum has this steam locomotive. This was originally a Duluth Missouri Iron Range engine, was sold to the Duluth and Northeastern. You may remember I mentioned that in okay. And then they relettered it back to Duluth Missouri Iron Range, and this is it running on their little North Shore Scenic Railroad, which runs between Duluth and Two Harbors. So this was actually taken in May. So I leave you with, or finish with, hopefulness. We just got a second Amtrak train to Chicago. This is the Borealis. There it is at Lake City. This train runs during the daytime. We still have the Empire Builder, which goes from Chicago to Seattle and Portland. But was often late coming particularly from Seattle. And the states of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois got together, which is a miracle in itself, getting those 3 states together. But they did, and they're now running this train on a daytime schedule. So Union Depot in St. Paul at 11:50 a.m. gets to Chicago about 6:30 or 7. And it has its opposite number that gets up to the depot about 6:30. So this is it on its second day of operation in May. It just started on May 21st. So so far the patronage on it it's been doing very well. So things are looking up. If you're looking for something in the country to look up to, say, well, there's one more passenger train. So, and if we all like trains, that's a good thing. So.
Now that's the one that stops in Wabasha too.
It doesn't stop in Wabasha. It stops in Winona and Red Wing.
Oh, wait.
It goes through Wabasha.
Maybe it's my granddaughter takes it up from Chicago once in a while,
Okay.
but maybe it's when she gets off.
Yeah. Yeah, well, my son used to he went to school at Winona State, and we'd always put him on the Empire Builder then, but there's a school in La Crosse also, so. So before I go through the quiz sheet, do we have any questions people want to ask, or you're welcome to ask.
So did you become a train conductor?
No, I did work for railroad up in Upper Michigan, where I was basically the depot agent and the dispatcher and jack of all trades. And that was fun for a while, but it was Upper Michigan, so
Yeah,
not really my cup of tea. So I'm a city boy. It was interesting.
Yeah, up in Stockton outside of Winona, the presidential car has been stored there and restored. Have you been there?
At Stockton?
Yes.
Yes, yeah. I haven't been inside the car, but I've certainly
Well,
seen
you can rent it and have dinners in
it.
it.
Oh, well, that's probably a good idea. I like that.
It's very nice for that kind of a gathering, because there's room around the car.
Okay.
For catered meals,
But if you get on the car and eat, or do you eat outside?
yeah, depending on how many people
Okay,
are on the
okay.
car. Because it's all furnished and the bedrooms are all
Are all still there?
the way they used to be.
Excellent, excellent.
have you traveled a lot on trains?
You know, interestingly, my bit with trains is, my big thing is photographing trains and writing for trains. I'm not a big rider. But just to give you some idea, I'm leaving in a week for Brazil and Chile just to photograph trains,
Oh,
not to ride. So, and because they have older diesel locomotives down there that we used to use in the 1970s there. And they're still running them down there. So myself and another fellow are going down to. But yeah, I'm not a big, I am, to start that trip though, he lives in very northern Illinois, so I am taking this train down to Sturtevant, Wisconsin, and then he's gonna pick me up, and then the next day we'll fly out of O'Hare. So,
I took a train up to New York once. And
did you?
interesting.
Yeah, well, Amtrak is an interesting thing. You could be on a train with a great crew and everything's great and the food's good. And then the next one you get on, the crew is a bunch of jerks and the food stinks, and it's just, they have never been consistent. So I think part of that is because it's quasi-governmental and there's not a lot of, they can't put the hammer down on too much. So,
And I traveled in Europe on a train too.
and of course, everybody always says, everything.
That was good.
It was good, yeah. Europe is wonderful.
One of your slides showed the largest railroad bridge in Minnesota. What is that close to?
It's west of Somerset. It's on the Minnesota side, there's really not a town, but if there's a road out of Somerset that'll take you right to the east end of it. The shot that you saw that I took, I had to hike down the Minnesota side and hike down to the bridge, which was about a mile. But it's just west of Somerset. So, and you get a good look at it.
Have you published books of your photographs?
I published books, are not all my photographs, but quite a few. The latest one I did, which was 10 years ago or over 10, is called Minnesota Railroads, a Photographic History from 1940 to 2012. And you get it on Amazon, if you just look her up, or punch my name in. And that's got a lot of my photos in it. Not the early ones, obviously I wasn't around in 1940, but a lot of the stuff from the I started shooting pictures of trains about 1970. So I pick up from there.
Your winter stuff is amazing.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't think I'll do it anymore. Now I'm in Palm Springs. But back in the day, it was sure fun, so. It was cold, and it's weird now, we either have a mega winter or none, so. When the years we had the mega winter, you can get some good shots. So the roads have to be open in order to do it usually, so. Yes,
So different kind of question,
sure,
and it's, you talked about, and I was wondering before you explained it, how they don't have crashes, you know what I mean, how they know, especially in the old days when they used watches and they didn't have GPS systems or communication systems. How did they do that in the 30s and 40s with different trains, using some of the same tracks? You had the guy at the, coming up with a plan, passing it up with your.
Yeah.
Because he went by, but how did he know?
so what? Each train would get an order, for example, and it'd say meet extra 759 west at Painesville. Do not depart, take siding, do not depart before 756 east has arrived. So that guy would go to that siding and have to sit there and wait for the other guy to show up.
Okay.
And then they also had signal systems I mean, not all of them did. A lot of them were just train orders like I just described. One of the things that happened in the thirties and forties, they started putting in what's called CTC, which is basically electronic control. So the dispatcher could throw the siding and they would just look at a signal. And when the signal went green, you went. And when you got to a siding, it was yellow, and was thrown against you, you went in the siding, the other train. That took all that out of the equation, but most lines operated, they call it train order and train order operation.
Okay, so they knew the trains that were coming into their zone
Right.
and leaving their zone, and they made sure that. things
Yeah,
were-
and back then, you had stations every
Yeah,
10 miles. So if the dispatcher wanted to change the meet, he would get a hold of the guy in the depot, either by telegraph, later telephone. And that would. What's going on?
You said telephone.
Oh, the old train's coming in. But, they would, they could get a hold of the depot agent if they needed to change a meet or something like that, but they still had. The guy didn't read his order right, and
yeah.
it still does occasionally happen. And today, though, in some ways, they still do that on lines that aren't signal, they just do it via radio. And then the other thing that's happened, and you may have heard about, is called PTC, Positive Train Control. And that's introduced computers into the whole thing. And so now they could send that order, like all the cabs of the engine has a computer in it. They can send an order right to them. The guy will just look on his screen, there it is. So that's, and we'll stop the train if say we're gonna meet somebody somewhere. It will stop the train. It can sense it and stop it. So it's gotten much better.
There's a couple of examples of trains running together here in Chicago. Where the passenger train was leaving on the wrong track early or something, the other one was waiting. But the Chicago, and Northwestern rail yard, there was a collision there and one guy was killed. Back in, 08 or 09, something like that.
Yeah, it unfortunately still happens. Nothing's foolproof. Okay, anybody else? All right, well, go ahead.
My family and I took a trip out west, and on our way, we stopped at North Flat.
Oh, yeah,
And we took in the train station there, and I don't remember that they said something about they were one of the largest.
yep, it's the largest freight yard in the world.
And they had a number of trains that were being operated without an engineer. They were operated electronic. And they talked about how long it might be before trains across the countryside would be traveling, perhaps.
Well, they're
Autonomously.
in railroads management suites, that's their dream. But there's some problems with that. Certainly in a switch yard, they can control the trains. The guys actually have a belt pack and they can run the train, the locomotive, and they can switch, and that's fine. Then the next thing they're trying to go to is a one-person crew. So there would be only one person there, and that's kind of okay, except that when you're in Minnesota and it's 300 below zero and the train breaks in half because a couple are let go. How are you supposed to, what are you supposed to do? Now, they're claiming that, we'll have mobile guys around to help with that. Well, we drive in Minnesota in the winter, and particularly like think of Montana. I mean, you're going through the mountains and you have one person. It can be problematic. It could probably be done. But they claim that they'll try and do that, but they do in Australia. They've already experimented with no one on the train. It's ore trains in very remote areas. It's worked, although they just had one pile up not long ago. So it can be done, but I think it's going to be something that has to be in very specialized circumstances, where an area where you can get to the tracks and even because there's gonna be problems. I mean, I can't tell you, I've been doing this for almost 60 years. The number of times you follow the train, the train just broke in half, or, they hit a car, or I don't know what. And then it's constant delay. So that all works great as long as everything's working perfectly, but it's. When it's not working perfect.
Any hope, with us in Rochester, we've been yearning for passenger train for decades.
We'll need to see
more.
if somebody's
And I
gonna.
don't know how many groups have been dissolved, for many different reasons and. It's just a
Well-
total disappointment, because we, like you say, we enjoy driving to the cities, go to Fort Snelling, get on the rail and do everything we wanna do. You know, why did the state or what are all the ramifications? It's just really disappointing, really.
Well, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah,
Would you be willing to pay the cost of another interstate to St. Paul? Because that's what it would cost you. Because what you could do, the only real route that would work. Is you could run out of Rochester over to Owatonna. And then Owatonna, you build a new connector and go up the Union Pacific up into the Twin Cities, so there's no direct route from Rochester. So to rehabilitate all that track, build the new connections and do all that. It's probably by the time you're over gonna be about what a cost of a freeway would be. Now, the difference is in the United States, we don't bat an eye about building a freeway. We're like, fine, build it, but we need it, you know, bring it up as a train. Everybody's like. I still remember. Remember the zip line, they were gonna build the zip line from, they talked about building from St. Paul to Rochester and. And I apologize for any farmers that are here or anything, but they said, wow, man, this is gonna go through my land. And it's gonna disturb me all day and, this is terrible, this is terrible. Yet put another lane on 52, that's fine. You know what kind of noise level you're gonna, I'm gonna do my imitation of a zip line train going by you now. Here it comes. It's gone. And then, let's say it does that 20 times a day. It's only gonna go by for about 10 seconds. But everybody's head explodes that we're gonna do that. And that's part of the reason we can't do it.
right.
And no, you know, it's the NIMBY thing. It's Rochester says we really need this, but all the people between here and St. Paul go, oh, no.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I hate to say it, but you know, it's kind of the country that everything's impossible.
Yeah.
It took over 10 years to get that second train to Chicago on Amtrak, which already has an Amtrak train on the route. And the other part I don't understand, and I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of an environmental guy.
Yeah.
They make them do an environmental impact statement. Excuse me, the train already runs. What do you need an environmental impact statement for?
Yeah.
You know, and so it's stuff like that. It's just, so I think the only practical way is if we had the money. Would be you'd have to build a connection to Owatonna and. Run from, like I said, down from St. Paul, Owatonna over to Rochester. The only other thing you could do if you wanted just a little connection would be just Rochester to Winona and connect with the main.
Sure.
If you wanted to do that, but I just don't know that that's. You know, are we gonna have a Rochester, Chicago train? I don't know.
Well, and that was one of the proposals years ago,
Yeah,
and our state was going to go in default and stopped it. Wisconsin was ready to do it.
yeah,
You know, in Illinois, and we stopped it, which that was the real, you know.
Well-
And there was federal money that was gonna come from
there's
that,
these guys
you
that.
know.
There's these guys that work downtown here, they got a big checkbook if they really want it, those guys, called the Mail Brothers. They could do it, they could do it, they got enough money, but, it's just, it is the culture of our country that we decided to build freeways and roads. And everybody goes nuts if we talk about. You hear, I hear it all the time, they go, this is old technology, why would we? A high-speed train is old technology, why would, it's 19th century, and it's like, well, Wright brothers started in 1903, that's kind of old technology too. But there's just something about the railroad thing that but the younger people, like my son who's 27, they're the ones that are like, I don't want a car. And let me add, the other thing they always say is you're trying to get us, you want us out of our car, you want to take my car away. Well, they're not taking my car away, and I have trains. It's just an alternative. it's if you don't wanna fly, if you don't wanna drive your car, you have another mode. But everybody goes, but the difference too is there is not a passenger train in the country that's gonna make money. Just be 100% honest with you. If you ever hear somebody talking about Amtrak or profitability, they're nuts. It's not true. They will never make money, ever. So if and in our country, capitalism is big and you gotta make money. Well, guess what? If you took away the air traffic control and the FAA and all, the airlines wouldn't make a dime worth of money without the government at all. And your highway you're driving on every day is all subsidized by the government. So, but the problem is with building trains and things, you virtually almost have to write a check and say, here it is to build the train, and then everybody goes crazy. So, the highway trust fund hasn't paid for the roads in 15 years, and every year there's a supplemental, the gas tax is supposed to cover it. Every year there's a several $billion supplemental bill to pay for roads, which I'm fine with. I think we need it. But if you talk about the trains, so it's just really hard. Is that a long answer to your question? But it is really hard.
Yeah.
Yes,
And if you look at a lot of the European nations, which have wonderful.
Yep, I was just there.
trains and stuff, it's just. It seems so frustrating, and it's like, yeah, we have wonderful trails you can walk on, but they could have been used for something
Sure.
else,
Yeah. Well, it all costs money and when you bring up the money. Cause it would be really expensive. It just is. Now, once you build it, it's a great investment because it's not like a highway you have to rip up every 10 years and totally redo. You keep up on the maintenance of the tracks, that's gonna last you 50, 60, 70 years. So, once you do it, but it's that initial investment up front. But it somewhat is a culture, in Europe, they're all culturally. But the other thing they always say is, well, but they're much more dense in Europe and we're so much more, there's parts of France that are way. We're way more dense than France in many areas, and. So we could do it, but we just have the will for it, so I wish we did. But maybe someday. All right, so let's see who got the answers right, and again, you gotta be honest. The first train to operate Minnesota ran in what year? 1862. The locomotive that pulled that first train was the William Crook C. This millionaire businessman has helped establish the Minnesota-based Great Northern Railway. What was his name? James J. Hill. Everybody loves James J. Hill. They didn't like him in its era, by the way. Yeah. In the modern era, Rochester was once served by 2 railroads. What were they? It was D, Chicago Great Western and Chicago Northwestern. James J. Hill had a passenger train named in his honor. What was it called? The Empire. Streamlined passenger trains debuted in the 30s. What was the name of the first streamlined train to serve Minnesota in 1935? That would be the Twin Zephyr, just by a month ahead of the Hiawatha. In 1947, this passenger train ran to Chicago, the Twin Cities, first in the country to regularly carry dome cars. What was it called? It's the same answer, the Twin Zephyr. Amtrak took over private railroad passenger service in what year? 1971. Amtrak started a new train between Chicago and St. Paul in May. What was it called? The Borealis. C. What is the largest railroad serving Minnesota today? BNSF Rail. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Minneapolis is home to the largest coal burning steam locomotive still in operation in the United States. The steam locomotive is known as C, Milwaukee Road 261. Railroads today are more profitable than ever and have attracted the attention of investors. What billionaire bought the largest U.S. railroad to serve Minnesota in 2010? Warren Buffett. All right, so did anybody get them all right? All right, you got them all right. You win the door prize, and the door prize is a good one. It's a book all about the Union Pacific Big Boy. Oh, gee. Oh, wow. There you go. Now, who got close to them all right? Anybody else get one? So you can get. Oh, you got 9? Uh-oh, how many did you get?
I got 9.
You got 9? 11.
I got
11. Oh, 11 gets the first one.
Oh, I already have a copy of that.
You already have, oh, that makes it easier, so.
I got 11.
You got 11. All right, you have that? Now, you both got 9. So, have you got this one? All right, then you get it.
Thank you.
That makes it easy if you already got it. So. All right, well, thanks for coming out, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming, everybody. We appreciate a full house tonight. If you didn't get a chance to sign in or just check your name off, please do that on the way out. I will take your sheets, then I'll recycle them for you. If we don't have a garbage readily available. Yeah. Unless you want to, you can.
I should mind.
Yeah.
Man.
So when we were in Switzerland, we did an auto train.
Auto train?
Auto train.
What's that?
Yep. Yeah, we drove it on, didn't chain it down, stayed in the car, and they took it. Never got the other side.
This afternoon.
That was like, that was something I wanted to do.
Check it out.
So you guys are still.
Really?
Yeah, dude, I've been all over. Actually, when you called, I was just coming back from here, South Dakota. We went out there, we were to see Banks.
Yeah.
He is out on the Missouri River.
Oh, yeah.
Is he working out there?
Yeah, he is working at, Wetland State Park. And then we were up, we saw Heidi and Jacob at his park.
So. That's South Dakota as well, somewhere.
Yes, so up by,
Oh, okay.
up by Webster and.
Oh, yeah.
Is that like central?
No, he's up by the North Dakota border.
I came up on.
In the central part of the state somewhere?
He's pretty close. So
So,
yeah, we got to see his.
yeah, it didn't last night. We chased that train in December '76 and that line.
Yeah, so we all went, we took the 3 kids, so one.
They got, somebody.
Oh, that's cool. This was when, this summer?
So we actually
Yeah,
got-
God, just once they got out.
Yeah, yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, we were there 2 weeks.
Cool. Excellent.
So we
Well,
rented a
thanks for
car
coming.
this time.
All right, enjoy the walk.
Thanks, it was fun.
Oh, great, glad you
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, we went right before you guys.
Okay, that's one of your.
They're right.
Okay, I will.
Or at least tell Steve.
We should.
But yeah, we drove this car on. So like the first car and the last car, the
That's
sides
right, yes.
sit down over with the road.
They,
You drove on, you just
It was so
drove.
confusing, they stand.
Oh, no,
Yeah, drive
They did do
behind
that.
with the car. and
Yeah.
drive.
yeah, so you just.
In the back end, like,
No, we just came along the side of it. And then drove down the cars until we filled them up and
Oh, really?
never tied them down. no.
interesting. And they drop the train down. so it goes up.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, that way they didn't have to handle it.
Yeah.
Oh.
That's so much fun.
Huh.
You just got your break on.
Yeah. I left it in, yeah.
Well, at
It was
least you
an
liked it.
automatic, but I left it in third.
Well, good, glad you made
All
it.
right.
You know, the thing that got over us is.
Were you right, James? Yes.
Yeah, right.
And-
Railroad started tanks
And
on.
then it also, like you said,
They had such a mishmash,
very much.
trying to keep track of the
We didn't run a car over there.
timetables of the passenger
We did
trains.
the train everywhere.
We came up with a
Sometimes you had to
system
take an
that
Uber.
divided the country.
And, we did in the, we were saying like in Rome, we took the river.
Oh,
Subway system. in Boston.
So what about?
Yeah,
You know, place we walked around.
Like,
we did all the walking.
Yeah, I presume that they follow suit, all I know is about the US.
Yeah, just a
Yeah,
couple of.
because I think we have time zones all the way
All the
around.
way around, yeah.
Our place we were staying was out in the
It
city.
makes sense with the United States. I think, well, what about Europe? What about
Cool, thank you for coming. Glad you could come.
Oh, no, yeah,
I know you love. trains.
Yeah, it was interesting.
You know a lot, but not everything.
I don't know everything. I can tell my wife I do, but she doesn't want.
She knows better.
Yeah, she does.
How long you been married?
36 years ago on a Tuesday. 36, thank you. She's fantastic. And I do whatever she says.
And she puts up with you running out and taking pictures.
Yeah, and she doesn't wanna, do
You're
that.
not a fan at all?
Well, she tolerates it. But
Yeah.
that's always been our thing. It's like, you have your thing, I have my, she likes to golf and pickleball and things.
Oh, cool.
And I got my thing.
Cool.
So it works well. And they usually don't want her there. So.
Those winter pictures. Really cool. Not Aunt Lab school. Right in.
Oh, not like this.
Yeah.
Oh, this picture is from the
It's
55
too old.
Yep. The tower is right here. Because I look out at this church.
Oh,
in my
sure.
window.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know if this is the Presbyterian or the Methodist church. Probably, well, it's hard to tell,
And these were the apartments here?
I guess. Well, I kind of remember, I don't remember that, I remember there was a hotel here somewhere there. North of this church. And they're, well, that's how I know, and they went and sold the mail, so they sold it to our priest for $1, and then he sold it to Mayo.
Where's the church we go to?
Well,
Right in there?
yeah, it's in here somewhere.
Okay.
Oh, here's a school. I used to go to this one to play volleyball, it's in the basement. This is where Lord's is, I think.
Oh,
Is it? No,
okay,
Because that's
here's Mayo.
this is 2 blocks away, Lord's.
So here's Gonda
Yeah,
in here,
yeah.
and where's the church from Gonda? Right down through here?
Well, in this, it used to be on this side of the street, and now it's over here.
Okay.
It used to be here like this. Now it's over here, and they have a whole block, of course.
Okay.
And this is where the Dan Abraham Valley Living Center is. Although I see that out my window, so
I don't see a year on it. Oh, there it is.
it's over here, 55 to 58.
Okay. Circus, okay. All right, sir. I haven't called Carl yet to see what happened today.
Sure.
I've been too busy.
Oh,
So back, sounds great, I was gonna say, we're down through the bridge, we show a walk through there and we'll show them some of those spots. I remember getting.
Yeah, serious. But that, you know,
Yeah, the second one you showed.
She does have an office, so she goes in Wednesday, Thursday. Yeah, she is out in this.
Only flood. And you can't figure out how many people is there and all year flood. But it's there now. And then you finally get the story figured out. Tell them.
With this new
He was in this afternoon. He was the pictures where he goes up.
All right, she's in one of those.
Next thing you look at, he got videos on Facebook. Google, I took the railroad. Or Rochester. That's where I saw it. Put it out there. A lot of that. Use the weather, but I don't think.